You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The area known today as Belgium and Luxembourg was once called the Austrian Netherlands, with Brussels as its capital. This region changed hands from Spain to Austria in 1714 following the Treaty of Rastatt, which concluded the War of the Spanish Succession. Earlier, in the 1580s, the Dutch revolt had led to the separation of the independent Dutch Republic from this territory. What remained was the Austrian Netherlands, known for its strong Catholic faith and the significant influence of the clergy. This territory was not just a part of Habsburg Austria, but also a member of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1764, Joseph II took the throne as Holy Roman Emperor, overseeing a vast area of Central Europe that includes present-day Belgium, Germany, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, and Austria. In 1780, Maria Theresa, Joseph's mother, appointed Maria Christina, her favorite daughter, and her husband, Albert Casimir, as co-governors of the Austrian Netherlands. Both Joseph and Maria Theresa were reform-minded, with Joseph taking a keen interest in Enlightenment ideas. He earned the nickname the Philosopher Emperor and promoted a philosophy known as Josephinism, which criticized institutions he saw as old-fashioned, like the powerful church that was loyal to the Pope and thus limited his control. Shortly after coming to power, Joseph visited the Austrian Netherlands in 1781 to assess the situation and concluded that reforms were necessary. Politically, the Austrian Netherlands were made up of a series of federated and autonomous territories that dated back to the Middle Ages and had once been under Spanish control. These territories, known as the provincial states, maintained considerable control over their internal matters. This independence and the power in the hands of the estates of Brabant and Flanders were deeply valued. Even within these states, there was a growing sense of national identity, with figures like Jan Baptist Verlooy advocating for the Flemish dialect's linguistic unity as part of Flanders' national identity. The Austrian governors-general had to navigate carefully, respecting the autonomy of these provincial states and seeking some level of consent for their actions. Motivated by his faith in the principles of the Enlightenment, Joseph quickly started implementing reforms after assuming power, aiming to enhance the efficiency and governability of his territories. Starting in 1784, Joseph embarked on a series of extensive and ambitious reforms focused on modernizing the economic, political, and religious aspects of society, targeting institutions he deemed outdated. His approach to governance has been compared to that of Philip II in the Netherlands, as both leaders sought to centralize control at the expense of local traditions, which ironically led to widespread opposition from various social strata. Joseph set his sights on the Catholic Church early on, viewing its loyalty to the Vatican as a potential threat. One of his first major actions was the introduction of the Edict of Tolerance in 1781 to 1782, which removed special privileges for Catholics, aiming to level the playing field among all religious groups. Despite the goal of fostering religious tolerance, this move did not endear him to Catholics and failed to gain significant support from the minorities it aimed to benefit due to their small numbers. Cardinal Frankenberg was a vocal critic, arguing that the edict, along with eased censorship and penalties against the Jansenists, directly targeted the Catholic Church. Joseph's reforms continued with the closure of 162 monasteries, making marriage a civil affair in September 1784, and centralizing theological education by replacing various seminaries with a state-controlled general seminary in Louvain in October 1986, which taught liberal theology approved by the state, much to the dismay of the Church's higher echelons. In December 1786, Joseph took a liberal stance by removing all tariffs on the grain trade, though this decision was later retracted due to an economic downturn. He streamlined local charity organizations into a central brotherhood of active charity in April 1786 and implemented significant educational reforms. However, Joseph's most controversial moves were arguably aimed at dismantling the autonomy of various states within the Austrian Netherlands. In early 1787, he introduced two major reforms focusing on administrative and judicial restructuring to consolidate a centralized system. He dissolved the existing administrative structures dating back to Emperor Charles V's rule, establishing a single general council of government under a minister plenipotentiary, and created 9 administrative circles managed by intendants. Additionally, he abolished the localized, semi-feudal and ecclesiastical courts in favor of a unified judicial system aligned with that of Austria, which included a sovereign council of justice in Brussels, appeal courts in Brussels and Luxembourg, and around 40 district courts. These reforms, perceived as undermining the independence of the states, the aristocracy, and the church's position, inadvertently united these diverse groups in opposition to the Austrian administration. In the Austrian Netherlands, Joseph's efforts to modernize through reforms didn't sit well with most people. They felt these changes, inspired by the Enlightenment, were alien and threatened their way of life. The church's influence led many to view these reforms as damaging to their cultural and traditional values. Even those who supported the ideas of the Enlightenment considered Joseph's reforms too timid and not impactful enough. This led to widespread dissatisfaction that found its focal points in the provincial states, particularly Hainaut, Brabant, and Flanders, and even within their judicial systems. This discontent was voiced loudly through pamphlet campaigns. In several towns, the situation escalated to riots, necessitating the deployment of the militia to restore order. The provinces of Hainaut, Brabant, and Flanders, through a lawyer named Henri van der Noot, denounced the reforms publicly for breaching the principles of the joyous entry of 1356, a sort of traditional rights charter for the region. This unrest escalated into what's known as the Small Revolution in 1787. Despite attempts to quash the upheaval with civil militias, the governors-general became anxious as the Austrian military proved inadequate without local support. Militias, starting to identify themselves as patriots, had wavering loyalty. Concerned for the stability of their rule, the governors-general paused the reforms temporarily, without Emperor Joseph's consent in May 1787, seeking to calm the situation by asking for grievances in writing. This move, however, only angered those against the reforms more, and even upset the emperor, who recalled his minister Ludovico, Conte di Belgiojoso. Realizing the extent of the unrest, Joseph eventually withdrew his judicial and governance reforms, leaving his religious changes intact. He hoped this would appease some critics and divide the opposition, making it easier to manage. He also appointed a new minister plenipotentiary to manage the situation better. Despite this, opposition continued to grow, fueled by the Catholic clergy and gaining noticeable support from the University of Leuven. By 1788 and 1789, the situation had escalated to the point where some regions began withholding tax payments to the Austrian authorities. In a bold move, the joyous entry was nullified, and the estates of Hainaut and Brabant were disbanded, signaling a push for reforms through rapid and uncompromising measures, suggesting a desperate attempt to enforce change amidst growing resistance. After the Small Revolution was crushed, those against it didn't give up, but instead started to work together more effectively. Van der Noot, who stirred up trouble back in 1787, felt threatened and escaped to the Dutch Republic. There, he tried to get support from William V, suggesting that William's son, Frederick, could lead a Belgian republic if they managed to get rid of the Austrian rulers. William V, however, wasn't convinced by Van der Noot's pitch and didn't show much interest. Similarly, no political groups in the Dutch Republic were eager to back such a plan. Despite this setback, Van der Noot managed to establish a base in Breda, near the Dutch-Belgian border. There, a group of exiles began to gather, and the local Dutch people generally felt a sense of camaraderie with these Belgian patriots. As unrest in the Austrian Netherlands increased, thousands of people from Flanders and Brabant made their way into the Dutch Republic, boosting the patriot army in Breda, though it remained comparatively small. Back in the Austrian Netherlands, lawyers Jan Frans Vonk and Verlooy created a secret society known as Pro Aris et Focis around April or May 1789, with the aim of starting an armed rebellion against Austrian control. They handed out weapons and published revolutionary materials. Most of the group's members were from liberal professions like law, writing, and business, mainly moderates who didn't necessarily oppose the reforms by Joseph II on their merits, but were upset that these changes were made without their input. They received financial backing from the clergy. Initially, there was some disagreement among the opposition about how to proceed with the uprising. Van der Noot thought it was best to look for help from outside, whereas Vonk believed in self-liberation for Belgium. Eventually, with the support of the Belgian clergy, all opposition groups, including Van der Noot's, decided to come together. They formed the Brabant Patriot Committee in Hasselt. On the 30th of August, Pro Aris et Focis chose Jean-André van der Merch, or Van der Merch, a retired military officer, to lead the army of exiles in Breda. The committee set a date for the rebellion to start in October 1789, marking a united front in their quest for independence from Austrian rule. In the spring of 1789, the people of France rose up against King Louis XVI and his regime, kicking off a revolution that sent shockwaves across Europe. Not long after, in August 1789, the residents of the Prince-Bishopric of Liège followed suit. They managed to overthrow their ruler, Prince-Bishop César Constantin François de Hoensbroek, in a peaceful rebellion dubbed the Happy Revolution. The upheaval in Liège, fueled by the same Enlightenment ideals sparking change in France, was seen by many at the time as part of a wider revolutionary wave sweeping across the continent. Faced with calls for liberty and equality, the Prince-Bishop fled to Trier, while the revolutionaries in Liège declared a republic. The spirit of revolution spread further with the Brabant Revolution, which began on October 24, 1789. The émigré Patriot Army, led by Van der Merch and numbering 2,800, crossed from the Dutch border into the Austrian Netherlands, entering the Kempen region south of Breda. They reached the town of Hoogstraten, where they made a dramatic reading of the manifesto of the people of Brabant at the city hall. This manifesto strongly criticized Joseph II's governance and declared it illegitimate, drawing inspiration from a 1581 declaration by the Dutch States General against Philip II of Spain. The situation escalated on October 27th when the Patriot Army encountered a larger Austrian force near Turnhout. Despite being outnumbered, the Patriots secured a decisive and embarrassing defeat against the Austrians, sparking a series of successes. This victory at Turnhout encouraged many local Austrian soldiers to defect to the Patriot side. Bolstered by new support, the Patriot Army swiftly captured key territories, including Ghent on November 16th after several days of conflict, and later the town of Mons on November 21st. By December, the Austrian forces were forced to retreat to Luxembourg, leaving the rebels in control of the territory. Historical comparisons have been made between the entry of the Patriot Army into the Austrian Netherlands and an earlier event in 1566, when Louis of Nassau's invasion of Frisia ignited the Dutch revolt against Spain. These parallels underscore the revolutionary fervour of the time and the influence of earlier rebellions on later actions. When the Austrian regime fell, revolutionaries in what is today Belgium were at a crossroads, faced with the task of shaping a new state. Influential voices within the French Revolution, like Jacques-Pierre Brissot, were in their corner, cheering them on to take a leaf out of the American Revolution's book and declare their independence. By the end of 1790, they did just that, with a declaration of unity uniting Flanders and the Brabant states on November 30th, and a full-blown declaration of independence from Austria made official on December 20th. The revolutionary momentum continued with the capture of Brussels on December 18th, prompting the rebels to quickly get to work on drafting a new constitution. By January, they revived the States General, an assembly of provincial elites that hadn't seen action since the medieval ages, to ponder over what shape this fresh state should take. Gathering 53 representatives from various states and social strata in Brussels by January 1790, they embarked on creating a constitution that drew inspiration from the Dutch Wetlange of 1581 and the 1776 American Declaration of Independence. However, the liberal factions were none too pleased, criticizing the exclusion of broader society's voices beyond the guilds, clergy, and nobility, and denouncing the behind-closed-doors nature of the States General meetings as a slap to the face of popular sovereignty. Moreover, both Britain and the Dutch saw the newly declared independence with suspicion, doubting the fledgling state's capability to serve as a buffer against French expansion. Despite these challenges, on January 11, 1790, the United Belgian States was born, crafted through a treaty of union. The delegates agreed on unifying the states into one entity, setting up a sovereign Congress in Brussels to serve as the Union's parliament. Yet, the states maintained a high degree of autonomy, making most of their pivotal decisions independently. This delicate balancing act marked the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history, charting a course toward independence and self-governance amidst a backdrop of broader European political turbulence. Not long after it got started, the politics within the United Belgian States quickly divided into two main camps. On one side were the Vonkists, named after their leader Vonk. This group was essentially a liberal reform movement that viewed the revolution as a victory for the people's voice. They primarily drew their support from the liberal middle class, aiming to gain political power that had been, until then, in the hands of the clergy and nobility. While they weren't opposed to Joseph's reforms on the surface, they took issue with how they were implemented, viewing them as arbitrary and dismissive of the people's rights. The Vonkists were particularly strong in Flanders, known for its liberal leanings compared to Brabant. Facing off against the Vonkists were the statists, or sometimes called aristocrats, led by Van der Noot. This group had a wider support base, including the clergy, lower classes, nobility, and feudal corporations. They viewed the revolution as a necessary pushback against reforms they found unacceptable, with a keen interest in preserving traditional aristocratic privileges and the church's influence. The tension between these two factions eventually escalated over how provincial assemblies should be formed, a disagreement that the constitution offered no peaceful resolution for. The statists accused the vonkists of sharing the same extreme views as the radicals of the French Revolution. They managed to rally support in several patriotic associations, echoing the political clubs seen in revolutionary France and involving primarily the wealthy. By March 1790, the vonkists were forced out of Brussels by a mob. Then in June, an armed movement of peasants, led by priests and carrying crosses, marched into Brussels to demonstrate their support for the statists and their rejection of Enlightenment values. Influenced by radical changes in France, this mob incorrectly labelled the vonkists as anti-religious. With public support, Van der Noot went on to lead a crackdown on the vonkists, a period known as the statist terror. Key figures like Verlooy and Van der Merch ended up arrested and jailed. Vonk and his followers, now in exile in Lille, attempted without success to drum up resistance against the statists. Facing a government back home that was becoming increasingly reactionary, the exiled vonkists saw better chances in negotiating with the Austrians rather than continuing to oppose the statists. When rumours started circulating about Austrian forces possibly moving towards Belgium, the statists pinned their hopes on securing help from a Prussian military intervention, believing the Prussians might side with them. Just a few months after it was declared, in December of 1789, the Liège Republic quickly found itself under fire from the Austrians and ended up occupied by troops from neighbouring Prussia. However, disagreements on how to restore the old order led to Prussian troops leaving, allowing the revolutionaries to seize power once more. At the same time, the Brabant Revolution was left to unfold unhindered initially due to a lack of pushback from outside forces. This was partly because Emperor Joseph II got sick right after the revolution began. The only Austrian troops in the area, having been defeated early on and holed up in Luxembourg, had no chance to take on the rebels on their own. Plus, Austria was too caught up fighting the Ottoman Empire to focus on crushing the rebellion. Understanding the need for outside help to keep the United Belgian States afloat, the statists reached out to foreign allies they hoped would back them. Despite their efforts, support was hard to come by. The Dutch weren't interested, and while the King of Prussia, Frederick William II, showed some support by sending troops in July, pressure from Austria and Britain soon forced Prussia to call its soldiers back. When Joseph passed away in February of 1790, his brother Leopold II took over. Leopold, a liberal at heart, quickly made peace with the Turks and redirected 30,000 of his troops to quell the unrest in Brabant. On the 27th of July 1790, he signed the Reichenbach Convention with Prussia, allowing him to start reclaiming the Austrian Netherlands with a promise to honour local traditions and offer amnesty to any revolutionaries who surrendered. As the Austrian army, led by Field Marshal Blasius Columban, Baron von Bender, invaded the United Belgian States, they faced minimal resistance. Many were unhappy with the rebels' governance and their internal disputes. The Austrians were victorious at the Battle of Falmagne on the 28th of September. Hainaut was the first to acknowledge Leopold's rule, with other cities soon following suit. Namur fell on the 24th of November. The Sovereign Congress met one last time on the 27th of November, and then disbanded. By the 3rd of December, with the surrender of Brussels, the Austrians had taken back control, effectively ending the revolution. After the United Belgian States were defeated, a significant meeting took place in The Hague on December 10, 1790. The meeting was about figuring out how to restore Austrian rule. It wasn't just any gathering. It included big players like representatives from the Emperor and the Triple Alliance, which was a group made up of the Dutch, the British, and the Prussians. What they decided was pretty substantial. They agreed to undo most of the changes introduced by Joseph II. But even with Austria back in charge, people didn't just quiet down. There was still a lot of anti-government sentiment being spread, especially through pamphlets. One notable figure during this time was Gerrit Pape, a Dutch radical, who didn't just witness the unrest. He was vocal about his thoughts. He believed a complete overhaul was necessary for people's true happiness and freedom to be recognized. He wasn't just talking about small changes, he was calling for a new revolution. Meanwhile, another rebellion was happening in Liège. But like the uprising in the United Belgian States, it too was squashed by Austrian forces by January 1791. The Prince Bishop of Liège, who had been ousted during the revolt, was put back in his position, signalling the Austrian authorities' complete comeback in the region. The Vonkists, who had been exiled in France, saw the French invasion of their homeland as the key to achieving their goals, even if it meant putting aside their original nationalist aspirations. After their revolutions in Brabant and Liège were suppressed, many of these revolutionaries gathered in Paris. There, they formed the Committee of United Belgians and Liègeois, merging forces from both areas for the first time. They even raised 3 Belgian military units and a Liège Legion to join France's fight against Austria. The War of the First Coalition, which spanned from 1792 to 1797, was a significant collective attempt by several European monarchies to take down revolutionary France. France kicked things off by declaring war on Austria in April 1792, with Prussia joining Austria shortly after. The ensuing conflict saw France battling Prussian and Holy Roman Empire forces in the Austrian Netherlands. Despite a French victory at the Battle of Jemappes in 1792 and a brief occupation of the Austrian Netherlands and Liège, an Austrian comeback during the Battle of Neerwinden in the next year forced the French retreat. However, the tide turned with the Battle of Fleurus in June 1794, leading to the final expulsion of Holy Roman Empire forces and paving the way for France's permanent occupation of the territory. In October 1795, the French government made it official by voting to annex the territory, dividing it into 9 provincial departments. This era, known as the French period, brought sweeping reforms to the region. Adopting the French administrative system meant merit-based appointments, while newly introduced policies promoted legal equality and state secularism, reflecting the revolutionary changes France had undergone since 1789. Following their loss in the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the French handed over control of Belgium to the Dutch, but everything changed with an event in 1830. On August 25th, a nationalist opera performance in Brussels sparked a small rebellion among the city's middle class. This revolt was, in part, fueled by memories of the Brabant Revolution from a few years earlier. Right after the uprising began, the rebels started to wave their own flag, adopting the red, yellow, and black colours that had been used during the Brabant Revolution of 1789. These colours are now recognised as the national flag of Belgium. Some historians suggest that 2 groups from that era, the Vonkists and Statists, were early examples of what would later become the major political parties in Belgium, the Liberals and the Catholics, playing a key role in the country's politics after it gained independence. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.